My name is Sheriff Thomas Mitchell, and I've been the elected sheriff of Rio Blanco County, Colorado for 21 years now. Before that, I did 8 years as a deputy in Garfield County and another 4 years with Colorado Parks and Wildlife as a game warden in the White River National Forest. I've worked search and rescue operations in the Flat Tops Wilderness, recovered bodies from avalanche sites in the high country, investigated homicides in remote hunting camps, and responded to situations that most people can't imagine happening in what they think of as peaceful mountain country. I tell you this so you understand that I'm not someone who jumps at shadows or sees monsters in every dark corner. I deal in evidence, in facts, in procedures that have been refined over decades of law enforcement work. Or at least I did until October 23rd, 2024. Before I tell you what happened in the area we call the Cathedral Peaks, before I explain why I can no longer patrol County Road 8 after sunset, and why I've started keeping obsidian arrowheads in my patrol vehicle for reasons that would get me laughed out of any law enforcement conference, I need you to do something for me. If you're watching this video, if you follow these stories from sheriffs and officers who've encountered things that defy every rational explanation, please subscribe and like this video. What I'm about to share violates my oath of office in ways that could end my career and my pension. But after what I witnessed, after what I became, silence feels like abandonment of the people I swore to protect. And I'm curious, where are you watching from right now? Have you ever been to northwestern Colorado, to that high country where the mountains rise up over 12,000 feet, and the valleys between them are so deep and narrow that sunlight only reaches the bottom for a few hours each day? Have you ever felt like the aspens were watching you, like the rock formations were recording your presence, like the land itself was deciding whether you belonged there? Drop a comment below. Tell me if you felt it. Tell me if you've seen the doors. Rio Blanco County is one of the largest and least populated counties in Colorado. We cover 3,200 square miles with a permanent population of just over 6,000 people, which means there are vast stretches of territory where you can drive for an hour without seeing another human being or any evidence of human habitation except the occasional ranch gate or Forest Service road. The White River National Forest covers much of the eastern part of the county, rising up into the Flat Tops Wilderness, a unique geological formation where ancient volcanic flows created a high plateau that extends for miles with cliffs and mesas that look more like Utah than Colorado. The Cathedral Peaks area is in the southeastern corner of my jurisdiction, a cluster of rock formations that rise up from the forest like the spires of some massive stone church, hence the name. The Ute people, whose ancestors lived in this region for thousands of years before European contact, have names for places in the Cathedral Peaks that don't translate directly into English, names that roughly mean where the stone speaks, or the threshold place, or land that opens. The trappers who came through in the 1820s and 1830s documented strange occurrences in that area. Compasses that wouldn't work correctly, horses that refused to enter certain valleys, sounds like voices speaking from inside solid rock. The miners who came later, in the 1880s and 1890s, looking for silver and lead, reported similar phenomena, and several mining claims in the Cathedral Peaks were abandoned, not because they weren't productive, but because the men working them refused to stay there after dark. Most of that history has been dismissed as frontier superstition, as the kind of stories that arise when isolated men spend too much time alone in the wilderness. But those of us who work this county, who respond to calls in the deepest valleys and the most remote canyons, we know there's something else up in the Cathedral Peaks. Something that has nothing to do with superstition and everything to do with boundaries between worlds that shouldn't be as thin as they are. October 23rd, 2024 started as a cold autumn Thursday. I came on duty at 0800 hours, reviewed the incident reports from the previous night, which showed nothing more serious than a drunk and disorderly at the Meeker Hotel, checked the weather forecast, which called for clear skies and temperatures dropping into the low 20s overnight, and headed out to patrol the eastern part of the county. My patrol area that day covered approximately 900 square miles of mostly unpopulated territory, including County Road 8, which winds up from the White River Valley into the high country around the Cathedral Peaks, before connecting to Forest Service roads that eventually lead over to Garfield County. In late October, traffic on CR8 is minimal, mostly hunters heading up to elk camps and the occasional Forest Service vehicle. Most of my job is just being visible, checking on remote ranches, making sure hunters have proper licenses and aren't shooting from the road, being available if someone breaks down or gets into trouble in an area where cell service is non-existent and help can be hours away. I spent the morning doing routine patrols, stopped at the Buford store for coffee and to chat with some hunters who were heading up for the second rifle season, checked in on a couple of ranches where the owners were elderly, and I liked to make sure they were doing okay. Everything normal, everything routine. Then at 13:47 hours, I got a call on my radio that made everything change. Dispatch reported a 911 call from a satellite phone, coordinates placing the caller on County Road 8, approximately 16 miles east of the Buford turnoff, deep in the Cathedral Peaks area. The caller was a man, sounding extremely agitated, saying he and his brother had been driving to their elk camp when they saw something in the road ahead of them. Something that looked like a door standing upright in the middle of the pavement. And when they got out to investigate, their truck wouldn't start, and now there were more doors appearing all around them, and something was coming through. He couldn't describe what was coming through, kept saying it was too big to see all at once, that it didn't make sense, that they needed help immediately. The call lasted about 40 seconds before it dropped, and dispatch couldn't reach him when they called back. The satellite phone just rang and rang with no answer. I acknowledged the call and headed east on CR8. I've responded to countless strange calls over my career. Bears breaking into cabins, elk getting tangled in fences, hunters who've gotten lost and convinced themselves they're 20 miles from where they actually are. People see all kinds of things in the high country that have rational explanations once you get there and assess the situation calmly. I figured I'd find two scared hunters who'd seen a weird reflection or optical illusion caused by the angle of sunlight through the aspens. I'd calm them down, probably jump their battery, and send them on their way. I figured wrong about everything. County Road 8. Through the Cathedral Peaks section is a narrow gravel road that climbs steadily through dense aspen forest, winding around massive rock formations that rise up on either side like walls. The road follows an old mining route from the 1890s, and there are still remnants of that era visible in places: rusted equipment, collapsed buildings, adits driven into cliff faces that haven't been entered in over a century. In autumn, after the aspens have turned, but before the snow flies, it's spectacular country, golden leaves against gray rock and deep blue sky. But it's also isolated, remote, The kind of place where if something goes wrong, you're on your own for a long time before help can reach you. I turned onto the Cathedral Peaks section of CR8 at 14:02 hours and immediately noticed that something felt off. The light was wrong. The sun was in the western sky, where it should be at that time of day. But the quality of the light was strange, diffused, like it was passing through some kind of filter or haze, even though the air was perfectly clear, and there was no sound. The aspens in October usually rustle constantly in the wind, that distinctive whisper that you can hear from miles away. But this afternoon, there was no wind, no sound, just absolute silence that felt heavy, oppressive, like the air itself had become thicker. At mile marker 34, about 3 miles from the coordinates where the hunters should be, my radio began producing interference. Not normal static, but a sound like low-frequency rumbling, almost subsonic, that I could feel in my chest more than hear. I tried calling dispatch and got nothing but that rumbling, rising and falling in waves. I checked my cell. Phone. No signal, which was normal this far into the mountains. But the phone itself was behaving strangely, the screen flickering, the battery indicator jumping from 80% to 20% to 100%. I checked my watch, a basic analog watch I've worn for 15 years. The second hand was moving, but it was moving in jerks, advancing 4 seconds, pausing for 2 seconds, advancing 1 second, pausing for 5 seconds. Time was behaving wrong. I looked back at the road ahead and saw the vehicle. It was a dark green Ford F-250 with Wyoming plates, stopped in the middle of the road, about a quarter mile ahead. The hazard lights were on, but flashing at intervals that seemed irregular, too slow and then too fast, creating a strobe effect that was disorienting to watch. As I approached, I could see 2 men standing outside the truck, both facing away from me, both completely still, looking at something I couldn't see yet. I pulled up behind the F-250 and activated my light bar, standard procedure, though something in my gut was telling me that nothing about this situation was standard. The temperature outside had dropped dramatically. When I'd been 3 miles west at mile marker 34, my external temperature gauge had shown 52 degrees, comfortable autumn weather. When I opened my door, the air that hit me felt like it was below freezing, cold enough that my breath fogged immediately and my fingers started to ache within seconds. But it wasn't consistent cold. As I walked toward the 2 men, I passed through zones of temperature, stepping from below freezing air into almost warm pockets and back into cold again, like there were layers of different climates occupying the same space. And I could smell something. Not the clean pine and aspen smell you expect in the high country, but something else. Something mineral and electric, like ozone after lightning, but stronger, more intense. I called out to the 2 men, identified myself as Rio Blanco County Sheriff, asked if they needed assistance. Neither of them responded. Neither of them moved. They just stood there, maybe 20 feet from their truck, staring at something ahead of them on the road. I moved up alongside them, and that's when I saw what they were looking at. There was a door standing in the middle of County Road 8. Not a doorway attached to a building, not some piece of debris that had fallen off a truck. A door. A freestanding door, approximately 7 feet tall and 3 feet wide, made of wood that looked ancient, weathered, covered with carvings I didn't recognize. The door was standing upright on the gravel road, and it was slightly ajar, open maybe 6 inches, and through that gap I could see light, but not the light of the forest on the other side of the road. different light, blue-white light that seemed to pulse with a rhythm I could feel in my bones. And there were more doors. As my eyes adjusted to what I was seeing, I realized there were doors everywhere. Standing between the aspen, trees, leaning against rock formations, lined up along the side of the road like fence posts. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds, all of them slightly ajar, all of them showing that same pulsing blue-white light through the gaps. I asked the two men what was happening. The one on the left, older, maybe in his 60s, turned his head slowly to look at me. His eyes were normal at first. Then his pupils dilated until they filled almost his entire iris, and I saw something reflected in those black pupils. Not my reflection. Something else. Something massive and complex, geometric patterns shifting and rearranging themselves. When he spoke, his voice sounded distant, like it was coming from somewhere far away, even though he was standing right next to me. "They've been here all along," he said. "The doors, the thresholds, the places where you can step from this world into the space between worlds. The Ute knew about them. They marked them. They made agreements about when and how they could be used. But when the miners came, when your people came, they ignored the markers. They built roads through the threshold places. They drilled into the rocks that were sealing the doors. They broke things that should never have been broken. And now the doors are opening again. Now the things that live in the space between worlds can come through. And they're curious. They want to see this world. They want to understand what we are. They want to decide if we belong here or if we're just intruders, temporary occupants in a place that's always belonged to them." I asked him what he meant by things that live in the space between worlds. What was coming through the doors? He smiled, and it was not a reassuring smile. "Look," he said, and pointed at the nearest door, the one standing in the middle of the road. "Really look, not at the door, at what's coming through." I didn't want to look. Every instinct I developed in 33 years of law enforcement work was screaming at me to get back in my patrol vehicle and drive away as fast as possible. But I was the sheriff. I was responsible for this county and everyone in it. If there was a threat, I needed to assess it, understand it, figure out how to protect people from it. So I looked. I really looked at the door in the middle of the road and at what was emerging through the gap. It was difficult to perceive because it didn't have consistent form. It looked like geometry come alive, like mathematical concepts given physical presence. Angles that shouldn't be able to exist in three-dimensional space. Surfaces that reflected light in ways that created the illusion of depth extending infinitely inward. Colors that my eyes couldn't quite process. Shades that existed somewhere between blue and violet and something else entirely. And it was moving through the door. Or rather, it was manifesting through the door, pulling itself from whatever space existed on the other side into our reality. As it emerged, the air around the door rippled like heat haze, space itself distorting to accommodate something that didn't quite fit into the normal laws of physics. The rumbling I'd been hearing through my radio grew louder, and I realized it was coming from the thing emerging through the door, a vibration that resonated at frequencies just below and just above normal human hearing, creating a pressure in my skull that felt like my brain was expanding and contracting with each pulse. The two hunters were changing. I could see it happening. Their skin was taking on a translucent quality, like they were becoming less solid, less fixed in place. Their bodies were starting to flicker, appearing and disappearing in rapid succession, like they were existing in multiple states simultaneously, present and absent at the same time. And they were smiling, both of them, smiling with expressions of absolute joy, like they were witnessing something wonderful rather than something that violated every principle of reality I'd spent my life understanding. The younger one, maybe 40 years old, turned to look at me with those dilated pupils and said in a voice that harmonized with itself, "Don't be afraid, Sheriff. They're not here to harm us. They're here to show us what exists beyond the boundaries we think are solid. They're here to prove that the world we see is just one layer of something much more complex." The Ute were right. This place has always been a threshold. The Cathedral Peaks aren't just rocks. They're anchors. They're holding points. They're the places where our reality is tied to the space between worlds. And when those ties weaken, when the doors open, we can see what's always been there, but hidden from us. And we can choose. We can choose to stay in the single layer we've always known. Or we can step through the doors and exist in all the layers simultaneously. That's what they're offering. That's what they want us to understand. I should have called for backup right then. I should have gotten both men into my patrol vehicle and driven back to Meeker immediately. But my radio wasn't working, and I was 16 miles from the nearest ranch, and I was watching reality break down in front of me in ways that made my training and experience utterly inadequate. So I did the only thing I could think of. I walked toward the door in the middle of the road, walked right up to it, close enough to touch the weathered wood, close enough to see the carvings more clearly. They weren't random. They were symbols, characters from a writing system I didn't recognize, arranged in patterns that seemed to shift when I wasn't looking directly at them. And through the gap where the door stood ajar, I could see the space between worlds. Not darkness, not light exactly. Something else. A vast expanse that seemed to extend in directions that didn't correspond to up or down or forward or back. It was full of things moving, shapes that might have been creatures, or might have been forces, geometric entities that assembled and disassembled themselves, flows of something that looked like liquid light, but behaved like solid matter. And I could hear voices, thousands of voices, millions of voices, all speaking at once in languages I didn't know, but somehow understood at a level deeper than language. Voices that were explaining the nature of reality, the structure of the space between worlds, the rules that governed existence in dimensions beyond the three I'd always taken for granted. I reached out to touch the door, and the moment my fingers made contact with the wood, everything changed. The rumbling stopped. The flickering stopped. The two hunters solidified, becoming fully present again. And I heard a voice, not through my ears, but directly in my mind, speaking with clarity that bypassed all normal sensory processing. "You are a guardian," the voice said, "one who protects boundaries. We have been here since before your species discovered fire. We have existed in the space between worlds since before your reality stabilized into its current form. We are not alive as you understand life. We are not conscious as you understand consciousness. We are pattern. We are structure. We are the framework that holds layers of reality separate from each other. The Ute understood us. They learned how to perceive the doors without opening them. They learned how to honor the thresholds without crossing them. They made agreements with us, protocols for coexistence. But your people came and forgot the agreements. Your people built roads through the threshold places and drilled into the anchor rocks and treated this land as if it were empty, as if nothing was here that mattered. So we adapted. We learned to manifest more strongly. We learned to open the doors more frequently. We learned to show ourselves to those who would see. These two you call hunters. They saw the doors and chose to approach. They chose to open themselves to what exists beyond the boundaries. And now they will become part of the pattern, part of the structure, existing in all layers simultaneously. But you can choose differently. You can witness what we are and return to your single layer with the knowledge intact. You can become a guardian in truth, one who protects both sides of the boundary, your people from our manifestations, our thresholds from your people's ignorance. Will you accept this burden? Will you see and remember and warn? I wanted to say no. I wanted to get in my patrol vehicle and drive straight to the county seat and turn in my badge and retire to somewhere flat and empty where rocks were just rocks and doors were just doors. But I was standing in the middle of County Road 8 in the Cathedral Peaks with two men who were about to be transformed into something beyond human, and I was the only law enforcement officer for 50 miles in any direction. And these mountains were my responsibility, whether I wanted that responsibility or not. I thought about the Ute elders who'd maintained the protocols for centuries. I thought about all the miners and trappers who'd reported strange phenomena and been dismissed as crazy. I thought about everyone who disappeared in these mountains over the past 200 years, missing persons cases that stayed open forever because we never found bodies or evidence or any explanation for where they'd gone. I thought about my duty, not just to enforce laws, but to protect people, to keep them safe from threats, even when those threats existed outside any legal framework I'd been trained to handle. Yes, I said, just that one word. But it was enough. The geometric entity that had been emerging through the door solidified for just a moment, taking on a form that was almost comprehensible, almost recognizable as something that could exist in normal three-dimensional space. It looked at me, though it had nothing I would call eyes, and I felt its acknowledgement, its acceptance of my agreement. Then it stepped back through the door, returning to the space between worlds. The two hunters completed their transformation. Their bodies became fully translucent for 3 or 4 seconds, and in that moment of translucence, I could see through them to something else, some vast network of connections extending in every direction, linking them to places and times I couldn't identify. Then they solidified again, but changed. Their proportions were slightly different. Their eyes reflected light differently, with that same geometric pattern I'd seen in their pupils. They turned to look at me, and both of them spoke in perfect unison. Thank you, Sheriff. Thank you for seeing us. Thank you for accepting the duty. We will exist in all the layers now. We will be part of the pattern. We will walk all the times and all the spaces that this threshold opens onto. And we will remember that you stood at the door and chose to protect rather than to cross. Not everyone makes that choice. Not everyone has the strength to witness the space between worlds and then return to the single layer. But you do. You have been marked. You have been changed. And you will carry this knowledge for the rest of your time in the single layer. The doors began to close. All of them. Throughout the forest, all those dozens or hundreds of freestanding thresholds. They closed slowly, deliberately. the gaps narrowing until there was nothing to see through them but the normal forest beyond. And then they faded, not disappeared, but became less visible, less solid, until they were just suggestions in the air, outlines you could see if you knew how to look, but that normal perception would skip right past. The two hunters walked past me, walked straight through the space where the door had been standing in the middle of the road, and as they passed through that space, they faded as well, becoming translucent again and then invisible, stepping from this layer of reality into the others. Their truck remained, engine running, driver's door open, completely normal, except that the men who'd been driving it no longer existed in any form I could touch or talk to or write a report about. The temperature stabilized. The rumbling stopped. My radio came back online with normal static. My cell phone showed 3 bars and a steady battery reading. Everything returned to normal. Everything except me and my understanding of what normal actually meant. I stood there on County Road 8 for probably 20 minutes, trying to process what had just happened, trying to figure out how I was going to explain this. What words existed in the English language or in law enforcement procedure that could describe 2 men transforming into multidimensional geometric patterns and walking away into layers of reality that most humans never perceive. Eventually, I walked back to my patrol vehicle and sat behind the wheel and stared at the abandoned F-250 and tried to think. I could call it in as a missing persons case. 2 hunters last seen at this location. Vehicle found abandoned. No signs of struggle. No evidence of where they went. That was true. It just wasn't complete. But complete meant explaining doors that opened onto spaces between worlds and entities, made of living geometry and transformations that violated every principle of biology and physics. Complete meant the end of my career and probably a psychiatric evaluation. I chose partial truth. I radioed dispatch and reported an abandoned vehicle on County Road 8, mile marker 37, no occupants visible, requesting a tow and asking them to run the plates. Dispatch responded that they'd handle it. And did I need assistance with anything else? I said no. Everything was fine. I was continuing my patrol. Everything was not fine. Everything had permanently stopped being fine. But I was the sheriff, and I had a county to patrol and people to protect. And now I had knowledge about what existed in the Cathedral Peaks that would let me do that job in ways I'd never been able to before. I spent the rest of my shift driving through the high country, watching the aspen groves and rock formations, and now I could see them. The doors, hundreds of them, thousands of them, standing between trees, leaning against cliff faces, lined up along ridge lines like fence posts, marking boundaries most people would never know existed. They were closed, but they were there. Always there. Always ready to open when conditions aligned correctly, when the barriers between layers weakened, when someone approached with the right kind of perception or the wrong kind of ignorance. I did research in the weeks following that afternoon. I had to understand what I'd agreed to become part of. I found anthropological studies from the 1960s documenting Ute oral traditions about the threshold places, the locations where the barrier between worlds was thin enough that careful rituals could allow passage from one layer to another. The elders described the doors as sacred, as dangerous, as requiring respect and specific protocols. They said the geometric entities were not gods, but they were not natural either. That they were the framework itself, the structure that kept realities separate, and that disturbing them or ignoring their boundaries had consequences that could affect entire regions. I found geological surveys from the 1970s that documented unusual electromagnetic readings throughout the Cathedral Peaks area, places where compasses wouldn't work correctly and where radio signals behaved in inexplicable ways. The surveyors had recommended further study, but that study was never funded. The anomalies filed away as equipment malfunctions. And I found something else. A classified report from 1952, declassified in 2002 under a FOIA request, documenting a U.S. Army Corps of Engineers expedition into the Cathedral Peaks to assess the area for potential military use. The report described persistent spatial anomalies, gravitational inconsistencies, and visual phenomena suggesting dimensional intersection points. It recommended that the area be designated as unsuitable for military purposes and that civilian access be quietly discouraged. The recommendation was never implemented, probably because implementing it would have required explaining why. And explaining why would have meant admitting that the government had documentation of doorways to other dimensions in northwestern Colorado. I spoke to a Ute elder about 2 months after my encounter on County Road 8. He was in his 80s, a man who'd spent his entire life learning the traditional knowledge of his people, keeping wisdom that the dominant culture had tried to erase for over a century. He listened to my account without showing surprise. When I finished, he nodded slowly and spoke in Ute, then translated for me. "The doors have always been there," he said, "since the time before the mountains rose, since the time when the world was still forming. They are part of the structure of creation. My grandfather's grandfather knew the protocols for approaching them. He knew the songs that had to be sung, the offerings that had to be made, the times when it was safe to look, and the times when even looking could pull you through. Your people came and forgot to ask what was here before you. You built roads and houses and mines as if the land were empty, but the land is never empty. The threshold places were here first. The doors were here first. And the pattern keepers, the ones you saw as geometric shapes, they have always maintained the boundaries. They are not cruel. They are not kind. They simply are. They serve their function, which is to keep the layers separate so that each reality can exist without being overwhelmed by the others. When someone crosses a threshold without understanding, without permission, without the proper protocols, the pattern keepers make a choice. Sometimes they send the person back. Sometimes they transform the person into part of the pattern. Sometimes they allow passage to the space between worlds. You were offered passage, and you chose to remain. That choice has marked you. You can see the doors now. You can perceive the thresholds. And you must decide each day how to use that perception, whether to warn your people away from danger, or whether to allow them to find what they're seeking, even if what they find transforms them forever. The mark appeared about 3 weeks after my encounter. I was showering one morning and noticed a pattern on my right forearm that I'd never seen before. It looked like a tattoo, but I'd never gotten a tattoo, and it definitely hadn't been there the previous day. The pattern was geometric, angular lines and shapes that formed something that looked like a door, or like a map showing the location of many doors, depending on how I looked at it. The mark was slightly warmer than the rest of my skin, maybe 2 degrees warmer, not uncomfortable, but definitely noticeable. I've met 6 other people with the mark since then. One is a BLM ranger in Utah. One is a National Park Service ranger in Wyoming. One is a tribal police officer from the Ute Mountain Ute tribe. One is a forest firefighter who works the Colorado high country. One is a rancher who's lived in these mountains for 70 years. One is a geologist who studies unusual rock formations throughout the West. We all have stories. We all have encounters with the doors, with the thresholds, with the pattern keepers that maintain the boundaries between layers. We don't talk about it openly. We can't. But we recognize each other. We know the look in each other's eyes, the weight of seeing, the burden of knowing. I requested a transfer to a different county 8 months ago. The request was denied by the county commissioners without explanation. My undersheriff, a woman who's worked with me for 18 years, pulled me aside after the commissioners' meeting and said something I'll never forget. Some sheriffs are elected because they're good at managing a department. Others are kept in office because they have an understanding of their territory that goes beyond law enforcement. You have that understanding now. The Cathedral Peaks need someone who can see the doors and protect people from wandering through them. That's you. That's been you since October. The commissioners know it. I know it. Everyone who's worked these mountains long enough knows it. Your transfer request was denied because you're needed exactly where you are. I think she knows. I think there's a network of people throughout the West, law enforcement, and rangers, and longtime residents who understand what exists in the threshold places and who work quietly to manage situations that don't fit into any official framework. I'm recording this because I made a promise at the door on County Road 8. I promised to witness. I promised to protect both sides of the boundary. This is me keeping that promise. This is me telling you that there are places in the Cathedral Peaks where doors stand between our reality and the space between worlds. If you come to northwestern Colorado, if you drive County Road 8, if you hike into the high country around the Cathedral Peaks, respect the boundaries. Don't approach doors that shouldn't exist. Don't touch carved wood that appears in impossible places. Don't try to look through gaps that show light from somewhere else. The pattern keepers are real. The thresholds are real. The transformations that happen to those who cross without understanding are permanent. If you ever find yourself in Rio Blanco County and you notice doors standing in places where no doors should be, turn around. Leave the area. Don't investigate. The thresholds call to certain people. People whose consciousness is naturally sensitive to the boundaries between layers. People who might see the beauty in the geometric patterns and forget the danger of crossing without permission. Most people drive through the Cathedral Peaks without ever seeing the doors. But some are called, some see, some approach. And for them, the pattern keepers wait patiently in the space between worlds, maintaining their ancient function, offering passage or transformation or return depending on factors I'm only beginning to understand. I'll be out there tonight. I'll be out there every night for the foreseeable future. I'll be patrolling County Road 8 and the other roads through the Cathedral Peaks. I'll be watching for people who show signs of seeing the doors. I'll be warning hunters and hikers away from threshold places. I'll be maintaining the boundary between the single layer most humans live in and the infinite layers that exist in the space between. That's my duty now. That's the price I pay for saying yes to the pattern keepers, for accepting the mark, for becoming a guardian of the thresholds. The doors are always present. The pattern keepers are always watching. And now, so am I. My name is Sheriff Thomas Mitchell, Rio Blanco County, Colorado, threshold guardian, keeper of the protocols, witness to the space between worlds. Welcome to the Cathedral Peaks. The doors remember everyone who approaches them. The pattern keepers are always maintaining their function. And somewhere in these mountains, in places where aspen groves meet ancient rock, the boundaries between layers grow thin enough that what should be separate bleeds together, and those who see must choose between crossing and protecting, between transformation and duty, between the infinite layers and the single reality we call home.